Hello, I'm Nina Siniakova, and this is a show, 5 Questions for a Composer. Being a composer is a challenging, honorable, and exciting thing. It is challenging because every composer creates his or her own world that they are eager to share with others. That requires work day after day. That requires searching, looking, and trusting in that what you're doing. It is honorable because then composer is allowed to share his or her creation with others. It also allows composers to have an impact on people's life, make them better, make them think. It is an extremely exciting thing because composers have a right to enter a wonderful world of creation. It allows a composer to understand, feel all the vibrations of the world and transfer them into sounds that they can be heard and shared with others. People presented in the show are of a unique kind. That's being said, composer is not someone who can compose. It's someone who cannot live without composing. These episodes are created in collaboration with New York Composers Circle. This organization unites composers and performers of New York City and its greater area. It was founded in 2002 when Jacob Goodman decided to start salons, meetings, where composers could perform music for one another and receive feedback. By now, in 2020, the organization has over 50 members, and beside the salons, there are public concerts where a wide audience can hear compositions written by the members of New York Composers Circle. I have a pleasure of being a member of New York Composers Circle since 2011. Thanks to this involvement, I had a chance to meet the most exceptional composers and performers, collaborate with them, and even perform on stages of Symphony Space, St. Peter's Church, and many others. The hero of today's show is the member of New York Composers Circle, Timothy Lee Miller. Composer, arranger, orchestrator, and publisher, Tim Miller has written music for chamber ensembles, orchestra, voice, as well as jazz music for big bands and small combos. He has received numerous commissions, special recognitions, and awards. He was first introduced to music through his mom, who was the pianist at church when Tim was growing up. His 2 sisters began taking piano lessons when the future composer was just 3 years old, so he kind of played along too. He always knew from that point on that music was going to be a big part of his life. Tim started playing the trumpet when he was in 3rd grade and wrote his first official piece of music when he was in high school. A friend asked to set some lyrics she had written to music. The lyrics were based on the Pied Piper story, so his first piece was called The Piper. Tim wrote it with blue ink pen on blue monographic stuff paper, and even has the original music framed and hanging in his office. You are a composer who writes contemporary classical and jazz music. How do these 2 parts of your musical personality coexist? As a jazz musician, do you learn from yourself as a contemporary composer, and vice versa? Do you use any of your jazz experience when composing classical contemporary music?
I actually don't look at them as two separate personas, or even really two different genres for that matter. I really do think that, with few small exceptions, that they really are one and the same. My classical music tends to inform my jazz, and vice versa. My jazz tends to inform my classical music. I think that if you did an analysis of my music, classical and jazz, you would find that there's a lot of common techniques, common chordal progressions, a lot of techniques that I use that really I don't distinguish between one or the other. I've written pieces that really blend both, and that's kind of really my focus. Orchestrally, I'm really trying to do that more, where I create jazz orchestra pieces that are that hopefully will be presented on a classical stage. I'm currently writing an opera, which very much crosses the lines, and it certainly blurs the lines in some places in the arias where the chord voicings are very jazz derived.
Tell us about your connection with New York Composers Circle. What do you enjoy the most about being a member of this organization?
I first became aware of New York Composers Circle in 2015 when I saw a call for scores for the annual John Eaton Memorial Composition Contest that we run. I don't think I really submitted anything. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure I didn't, but I did inquire. It seems like I saw an email sent out by Hubert Howe, executive director, about membership, and so I replied to that. And I didn't get a response immediately. As a matter of fact, I had to kind of coax him along a little bit. And eventually, I think in October of 2016, I attended my first salon in the city. And a couple of salons later, I was introduced as a member. And within a year, I was on the executive committee just because I was deeply interested in learning more about what was going on. And I started attending the committee meetings. And when it became noted that we needed a redesign of our website, I raised my hand and said, hey, I've done this. I've managed my own website for years. So I did it, and the rest is history. I am now the admin for our website.
Oh, wonderful. Now tell us about your piano etudes. I had the pleasure become very familiar with the piece. I have performed etude number 2 and number 3. What inspired you to compose this music?
So my piece, Intervals, it was something that I was inspired to do following a fellowship that I did in 2015 at the North Summer Music Festival in Knoxville. Knoxville's where I grew up. And I went back there for this festival. And I had written a piece for flute, cello, piano, and percussion called 224 Slices of Pie. Yes, the number pi. So it was a serialized piece based on different aspects of the number of pi. And I took the first 224 decimal points of pi and I serialized that. There were 3 movements. The first movement was literally just the 224 decimal points, each number representing an interval. And I determined to, based on keeping it within the octave system that we have, the 8 octaves, and the instruments that I was assigned to write for, flute, cello, piano, and percussion. So I had to do some octave transpositions to keep it, playable. So the third movement, I'll get to this in a minute. The third movement of Intervals, this piano etudes, is basically the third movement of my piece, 224 Slices of Pie, and I'll explain that in a minute. So with this Intervals, I continued my experimentation with intervals, serialized intervals, in this piece. So the first movement is just based on ascending intervals from a minor second up to an octave. I didn't go beyond that. As far as the base context of the movement. So and each statement of it just goes up like that. So it starts back at a minor second and goes up. And I played with different rhythmic variations of that, and created, kind of a quirky piece that it's kind of a minimalist piece in that regard. The second movement is actually based on the Fibonacci sequence, which is 1, 1, 2, 3, 8, 5, etc., etc. And so I derived the intervals of that, including the rhythms from that sequence. And at one point, on the piano, it starts low and then goes high. And at some point, I actually start low and high and go backwards and cross. And it just creates kind of an interesting experiment based on that number. The third movement, like I said, is based on my 224 slices of pi. And that is a series of chords that are based on the numbers prescribing, number one, the number of eighth notes that are within each measure, and the number of notes that are played within each measure, as well as the number or the intervals between those notes in the chord. So if the number 4, there will be 4 notes, and each note actually is a fourth apart. One being actually either unison or octaves. I used it that way, and same for 0.
You are a trumpet player. How hard is it for you to compose for piano? By now it's been an overwhelming amount of piano music written. What's the challenge for you when you compose for a piano?
I am not a piano player, that's for sure. I mean, I took class piano in college like everybody else had to do. and what piano playing I do is really hunting and pecking, kind of like I started typing. I learned to type by hunting and pecking, but I could not pass as a true piano player. But I do write at the piano, and it's sitting there in my writing setup, and so I do write using the piano. But it's strictly from a finding chords, finding voice leadings and things like that I really want to focus on in my writing. As far as trying to compete with the 300 years of literature, I don't look at what I do as a composer as competing with anyone. If I did that, I certainly would not win those competitions. I've entered hundreds of competitions, and I do that for the exposure to my music, not necessarily to be the winner, declared the winner, but
composers' ideas, philosophy, and inspiration sources change as they grow and develop. At this phase of your life, what inspires you? What are you writing about? What are the images behind the scene?
this is actually a really good question. The early part of my writing career was all about trying to figure out, how to compose. Who am I as a composer? Trying to actually learn the craft of composition. I certainly was not a born, compositional genius like somebody like Mozart. I would like to think that, but no, I'm not. Everything I have learned as a composer has been arduous at best. Recently, or I went through a period of writing where I was writing about animals, birds and bees and things. So I wrote a piece called The Birds and the Bees in 2010, and a piece called The Calathumpian Duck, which is a noisy duck. And then I wrote a series. I've been doing a lot of art songs. And my first ones were based on Longfellow poems. And in 2016, I wrote a pair of art songs called The Bird Lady. One is the mourning dove, and the other one is the hummingbird. And from those, I actually have spun an opera. I wanted to create an opera based on art songs, which basically are like arias, but I wanted to develop a story around this bird lady, this lady who talks to birds. So I found a librettist who took that and wrote a libretto to it. So I'm in the process of writing that. And that's really focusing a lot of my time right now on that specifically. But a lot of my music, I tend to like being someone that's grown up in the Southern Baptist Church. Christianity, spirituality is a big part of my life, and so I write a lot. I do write about a lot of biblical matters, particularly in my choral music, and it's things that, even though it may not be overtly the subject that I'm writing about, it's certainly my inspiration.